Hello, everybody. My name is Terry Riyasat. I am the Director of Creative Services and Learning Content at Foundry, and I will be your host for today. So before we get going, if you're at a studio and you want your team of artists to be able to go to a deeper dive in what I'm going to talk about here today, just contact your Foundry representative and we'll make sure that somebody from our creative services team gets in touch, and then we'll be able to set up a meeting and do so. Also, just a reminder that Hero Player is free for Nuke artists, and that's included as a part of Nuke or NukeX. It has a tremendous amount of features inside of it. A really powerful viewer, works well and integrates into pipelines very nicely. So it's definitely something to check out as an extension to Nuke for Nuke artists, and can be a part of a larger team with Foundry timeline tools. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started with the latest versions of Nuke. But before we do that, I want to have a quick look at what happened in Nuke 14. So I'm not going to highlight everything here because there was quite a few things, but just want to point out that the new 3D system was placed inside of Nuke 14. So there are two 3D systems, a classic and the new 3D system. And this system is built on USD architecture. This brought in new workflows, new ways to work inside of Nuke, and really reduce that friction with pipelines. Also, another thing to highlight is the Cattery, where you can download already machine learning models that have been converted to work inside of Nuke. And another thing I'll point out is that Hero Player got all of the OCIO soft effects inside of their helping with artist workflows. But now let's jump into Nuke 15. And not only 15, but also Nuke 14.1. So this is a dual release. Now the differences here is Nuke 14.1 is built on VFX Reference Platform 2022, and that is a continuation of the 14 series. And then Nuke 15 is keeping in mind all those studios that are using Linux, and with the CentOS end of life looming, this gives pipelines and studios a chance to move over to Rocky 9. Now, another thing that is Nuke 15 exclusive is support for Mac OS ARM, or Apple Silicon. So you're not running through an emulation with Rosetta anymore. You're running natively on the ARM architecture. So very exciting for those that use Apple. So if we look here at the supported operating systems for Nuke 14 and 14.1 on VFX Reference Platform 2022, and then Nuke 15 on VFX Reference Platform 2023. All right, so the first thing we're going to look at feature-wise is the updates that have been done to the 3D system. So let's go ahead and jump into this script. So now, if you're familiar with 14 and all the updates that brought in, so definitely some tremendous changes under the hood and workflow-wise. Now let's look at the continuation of these updates inside of Nuke 15 and 14.1. So I'm just going to jump to a different layout here so we can see our scene graph. And let's begin to look at a few things here. So we have our USD scene that is brought in. We have different stages and layers that have all been placed inside of the scene. And now we can explore some of the updates to the 3D system. So first thing you'll notice is that there is a new toolbar here. So this is the 3D toolbar. Some of the items that were previously located up above the viewer are now located all along the 3D toolbar. And this brings in some nice selection options as well. So now we can go in and we can select, and quite responsive when we're selecting around, we can go in and select our geometry, and we have different ways that we can be selecting our geometry. And if we open up the filtering section here, we're currently selecting by mesh and geoprim, but you have all different ways that you can go in and select your models within your scene depending on their type or kind. I'll jump over to component and notice that the selection here is we have this sort of highlighted orange, and then if we are switching over to kind, there's a two-tier system. So we're essentially selecting a layer at this point, and we can see the different color for the outline to differentiate the two. So I'm going to jump back over to mesh and select. Another thing that we can do is we can jump directly from here to our vertice selection or face selection. So if I go in and select, it's a two-tiered selection system. So I'm grabbing those faces that are confined within that selected geometry. And another thing we can do is you can see that we're selecting through, but through our filtering section, we can go in and enable occlusion testing. And this way, we're only selecting the faces that are facing the camera here. Nice thing we can do is also filter out geometry, lights, cameras. We don't want to be selecting those cameras as they're locked down. We don't want to touch them anymore. Or same thing with lights. We can just turn those off. And so that way we're not accidentally selecting anything. Also, you can be modifying your selection by parent or children, siblings, etc., all from the filtering menu. Another thing we can do is if I was to turn on the last section here, which is disabling occlusion testing, we'll be able to select through the faces, not just confined to that selected piece of geometry, but everything else that I'm selecting through the selection box. Okay, so one thing to note about the selection process is it's being decoupled from HD Storm inside of here, and this is all about laying the groundwork for the future work in the 3D system, specifically with Hydra render delegates. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is a new node that's been added, which is the GeoIsolate. And you can think of this as an inverse of the prune, but we'll be able to isolate any objects that we want to directly from this node. So normally we could go in and we can drag and drop into this section, or we could use the picker tool. I'm actually going to be doing something a little bit different here. Is I'm going to use the scene graph pop-up for mask knobs. So now what this means that we can have access to our entire scene graph just that pop-up. And what's nice is we can go in and we can do some filtering, and then we can hone in on those specific objects. Very handy if you have a really large scene graph. We can go and shift select and then turn things on, or vice versa, turn things off. We can also double click. So let's go ahead and grab the sofa, hit OK, and now we've isolated the sofa. We have options on how we want to treat the rest of the geometry that is within the scene. So we can hide the scene. It means that they're still there, but just not visible. We can be showing everything. Then we can be also deactivating everything. So at this point, you notice the scene graph gets cleared, and we are deactivating everything else from this point. And then also we can activate. So we're going to leave that at deactivate. Now, another nice thing you can do with the pop-up is also filter by type. So if we wanted to just hone in on our cameras, we can type the filtering followed by type and camera, and then it will just show us the cameras that are available. Next thing we're going to look at is the GeoMerge node, as this has a tremendous amount of updates. There are all new methods of merging when you're plugging in to the GeoMerge. So first thing we'll look at is a workflow that is brought back as a classic Nuke workflow. And what I mean by that is that we have some footage and we want to place it on a card. And then at this point, we want to go ahead and duplicate that card by using geotransforms and then merging them back together. So previously in Nuke 14, you had to give its own unique path inside of the scene graph in order for this to work. But now with the new merge method, so the default is merge layers. And if we go and look at that, what we're seeing is A2's result as it's on top of everything else, but we can choose to duplicate prims. And when we duplicate the prims, we now have that classic workflow brought back. And one thing to note is you can also duplicate in place. So if I have this unchecked off, you notice that the Nuke material ops are also being duplicated in here. But since we're using the same texture for all of them, we can go ahead and duplicate in place and clean up our scene graph by only passing through that one Nuke material op. There are other methods for merging as well. So the merge layer is the default method, which we saw earlier. Duplicate prims, we just had a look at. And then there's ways that you can also be flattening your layers. So everything in Nuke, when you create a node, is a layer. So when we are choosing to merge them, we can choose different ways to flatten them moving forward beyond the GeoMerge. So if we're choosing to flatten input, that means that everything that is being plugged into one of the pipes is going to be looked at as one layer after this merge. And then same thing that is being plugged in. So we'll have two layers coming out of here, but they will be flattened together. And then the final one would be to flatten all to a single layer, which would take all inputs going into the GeoMerge, no matter how many inputs they are. They would be looked at as a single layer moving forward after this. This will be especially useful for future workflows when you are exporting out of Nuke into, and you want to sort of define how your layers are looked at in another application or down the pipeline. So another thing we can look at here is we're isolating these props over here, and I want to transform the couch. So we'll go ahead and we're going to just isolate the couch, and we've deactivated the rest of the geometry. We have a geotransform as we're moving it along, and I'll just add this to prepend. So we'll go ahead and have this in place, and then we're going to go ahead and merge them back together. So the default de-isolate is turned off. So if we were to go in and use the default merge mode of merge layers, we'll notice that we're only seeing the couch because it is placed in the A pipe. We don't want to set this to duplicate prims because then we're going to double up on the couch. So we do want the merge layers method, but we want to de-isolate. So now we can have both being plugged into the B and the A visible. And what we're doing essentially is we're doing an inverse of this node by hitting the de-isolation. Next thing we'll look at is updates to ScanlineRender 2. So we have this model, and there is some animation on it, and we're just going to add a checker material onto it as well. And let's look at the updates to the ScanlineRender 2. So first thing is we'll look at the original ScanlineRender and then ScanlineRender 2. Now, there is been reordering done inside of here. So if we look at the main tab, we have our sampling right away. We have some nice presets for sampling as well. And then we have our camera section, materials, lighting, and then scene masks. And some of the knobs that aren't really used have been removed. So things have been cleaned up inside of here. And then let's go ahead and now look through the ScanlineRender. So first thing you'll notice is the type of noise that's being produced. And this is very much akin to the way ray tracing noise is treated. And this is a good thing. If you are familiar with Nuke and the general noise that you get from the ScanlineRender 1, you tend to see more of a banding. And this is the type of noise that actually you would prefer to see for this. So let's go ahead and I'll just up the camera samples here, something like to 25. We have a nice, beautiful, clean motion blur result. And this has been improved tremendously for this version of Nuke 14.1.15. And we can see it, maybe go a little bit heavier on here. Just nice and clean results. Another thing you can do that you couldn't do previously is turn off the motion blur if you wanted to. If we set the shutter to 0, you'll notice that it's been shut off. And then if we increase it, then we have our motion blur back. Okay, so now these are some of the new features that have been added. So great amount of work that and thought that has been put into this from the Nuke team. Now, as a compositing artist, what does this mean for us? Well, the reality is, we're going to be compositing a shot. So let's say this is the shot that we're working on, and we have to do our usual compositing tasks. So we have our passes, and we begin to assemble our comp. But now one of our tasks is, let's say we need to add some additional lights into the scene. Well, this means what we can do is we can be pointing at that USD file on disk and isolating what we need. And this means that we're not trying to get additional or custom exports to use inside of Nuke. We're using USD files. We have all that performance, tremendous performance gain, and we're able to load large scenes inside of here. And then in this case, we're isolating the wall. We're going to add a little bit of lights to the candles here. So we can bring in that geometry. We're pointing at that USD file. We're isolating the areas that we need. And in this case, we're adding a USD preview surface, and we're adding some roughness into it as we're going to be placing some lights here. So we go ahead and place the lights in position. And then now we can render out of the scanline and get our results here. So we now have this additional light that we can comp into our shot. Okay, then the next thing we were going to be adding is some additional the projection. So we're going to dirty up this couch a bit further here, so we can again use the traditional workflows. We're talking to that geometry, we're isolating it, we're adding our projection onto it, and this way we're not faking it with cards. We're getting the actual geometry and the deformation of the projection on the geometry, and then we're able to go ahead and then render that out as well. And then the candles that we saw earlier in that example, we're able to use the duplicate prim workflow. So we have our candle cards, we're duplicating them, putting them into position, and then going ahead and rendering them out. and then we're able to composite on top of that. Also, traditional workflows, we have some atmosphere that we're going to be adding. We're placing it on a card, and then we're duplicating that card, and then we're using the duplicate prims to bring everything back together so we can render out our pass and merge it with our existing volume pass, and then we can go ahead and then comp everything together. And then towards the end, we're doing any additional grading and color correction to complete the shot. So really, it's about that, yes, there is a new 3D system. It is USD based. It's bringing in new workflows, and really as a compositor, how to utilize these new workflows as a part of your day-to-day compositing. Okay, so to summarize some of the things we just looked at, there's the new 3D viewer selection. We have the new pop-up for the scene graph or mask knobs. They're the new geo merge nodes. Some things we haven't touched on, but we'll talk about now is USD version has been updated to 2305. And noting that users can specify their USD version for their needs. And also USD Python bindings have been added inside of here. So if there's Python inside of your USD files, you're able to communicate to it through Nuke's script editor. And if you'd have any questions you'd like to post, you can always go through our help menu down to forums, where we have our Nuke forums where you can post on any topic, but we do have a specific area dedicated to the 3D system that the Nuke team is monitoring. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is the updates to CopyCat and Air in general. So let's say I am compositing this shot, and there's some tasks for me to do. I need to go ahead and track and add some background fog into the shot. So from a compositing point of view, I'm going to have a matte for this guy who's walking through the forest, and then do my compositing work. So let's go ahead and jump into a Nuke script. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and grab our plate. So just a few things for CopyCat that we'll talk about here quickly is that we can go and speed up our training by doing a few things. First thing we'll do is we're going to crop this image down just to the area of interest here. And then we're going to make sure that we have black outside checked on, as we don't want the matte to be offset when we create it. We're adding a frame range to from 1 to 1, just noting that this sequence be looked at as a single frame sequence, because I'm only going to roto 1 frame for it. So we have 1 frame that's been rotoed. Now, how CopyCat works, if you're not familiar with it, it wants 2 inputs, a ground truth and an input. Ground truth is what we want our image to look like. Input is what our image currently looks like. And we have a preview input. Some of you may not know that. It is another input that you can pull out, and we're plugging in to our preview right from the cropped area. So we have our ground truth. We're shuffling out the alpha channel, and we're making sure we're using a keep. We don't want to have any extra channels. And then on the input side, we're just making sure we're keeping the RGB in here. So then we can begin to train. Now, CopyCat has been updated. There is a new training strategy that can reduce times of up to 50%. And it's quite lovely. It is a multi-resolution training as we push through this. So let's go ahead and start the training. And there's also updates under the progress section. So let me go ahead and just pop this out. And there's our preview. We can see it being refined as we train through. So under the progress tab, there's now below, we can see we have our contact sheet inside of here. We even have that preview that we have plugged in as well. So we can keep an eye on all things directly from the node itself. And this becomes especially useful when we talk about the next section coming up. And also, we can isolate different training that we've done in here. There's a tab where we can select it, and notice that it'll be corresponding to the color that's created here. So we can check on different trainings that have been done. So now that the training is complete, that went by quite quickly, we will go ahead and put this into practice. So our other task here was to track the shot. So we are doing so here. And then we're adding our fog into the scene. And then we are rendering it out, and then we're placing it back on top of our background. Now that we've trained for CopyCat, we have our plate, we have the inference node that's being applied to it. So we now have a matte. So we can go in and we can see that we rotoed one frame, but we now have 350 frames of matte. Perfect. I just have a grade node set to red in case any additional artifacts pop up here. I want to crush them away. I'm just softening the output a bit and shuffling the alpha into the plate. From here, just adding an additional garbage matte just for safety, and then pre-multiplying, doing some grading, and then placing it on our background. And then now we have our output. So we're able to utilize CopyCat as from an artist point of view by speeding up workflow for some of these tasks that we have to spend a lot of time on. We're able to do so quickly and really utilize it. And showing here, a matte example, but really remember, CopyCat, you train it with your own data, and this means that you can take it in any direction you want. We have a tremendous amount of examples on our Foundry Learn page that you can go ahead and take a look at under the machine learning section. So the next thing for this, we'll just sort of summarize. So there's the new training strategy, the multi-resolution training strategy. There is also a Mac OS metal performance shader support. This means that CopyCat takes advantage of silicon, and it's getting training times up to 11 times faster than previous. Now, another big update is distributed training for CopyCat. That's right. So this means that you can share your training load across multiple machines, and you would be doing this using standard render farm applications, something such as OpenQ or Deadline. And this means that you're offloading your training into other machines. As an artist, you can continue to work. You can keep an eye on this through a CopyCat node and then pointing at the training files and being able to see the contact sheet and the progression. And then you'll be able to work as needed, and then you can be pulling in loading that inference node and pointing at the training when it's done. There is also an option to select live updates, so you can see this training happening on the fly through a CopyCat node. Now, this is turned off by default in case you don't want to jam up the network too much if you have a lot of machines training, but you have that option to turn it on. And if you're interested in learning more about CopyCat and machine learning inside of Nuke, you can head over to learn.foundry.com/Nuke and check out all the tutorials we have. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about is OCIO updates and how they affect pipeline efficiency and productivity. So let's go ahead and jump into this script here. Okay, so this is actually a good opportunity to talk about a new Nuke UI element, and that is the saturation slider on the viewer. So we have our gain and gamma, and now there's also saturation. So very handy if you're doing QC. You don't have to drop any nodes to adjust the saturation. You can do so, and it's a soft modification directly from the viewer. We're not committing to it. It's on the viewer only. So great addition to Nuke. Now let's look at the right node. Just going to pop this up. So some logical reordering has been done here. So on the top, we have our paths for our file type, and then anything that is associated with options for the type of file that we're writing out. And now there's this new section, which is the output transform. And this is going to give us some more control over color. So let's say we were writing out this sequence to EXR and we're working with ACE-CG. Our transform type could be set to color space. We would choose what type of color space we're writing out to. Then we would go ahead and render. But there are times where you want to bake in the display transformation information. And this, maybe we're going to write out an MXF or we're writing out an MOV, and we want to go ahead and bake that in. Maybe it's just for a quick review. So in this case, we can actually change our transform type to display, and then we will bake in that display transformation. And in this case, we're going ahead and we're going to, what is our target display? Is it going to be a monitor? Is it going to be television or broadcast, or is it going to be a projector? We can go ahead and set that out here, change the view type, and then go ahead and render it out. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is aliases, and this is a feature of OCIO, and we have this included with two new OCIO configs that are packed in with Nuke, and that is the FN. You'll notice that this is new, the FN portion, and so there's a CG config and the studio config. and these already contain aliases inside of them. So this is extremely useful if we are updating, like say we were working in ASYS 1.2, and then we were updating to ASYS 1.3. When we would do this, a lot of the files would show an error because the transform type does not exist. But now with aliases, you can define different names for different configurations. And this means that we can go in and jump in and have all of those areas covered. An example of this would be something like dropping in RE log C4 into Nuke 14. Although the transform type does exist, you would have an error out and you'd have to select it from the drop down. But now if you're in Nuke 14.1.15, you don't have to worry because the aliases are alongside that. So this means that it is covered. You can define all the different types of naming conventions inside of there. So if there's any spaces or anything along those lines, underscores, you can account for those, and you won't have those errors when switching color spaces or when you're creating your new projects. Now, something to note, and this is a Nuke 15 exclusive, is that Nuke 15 is updated to OCIO 2.2.1, and the purpose of this is to be in line with VFX Reference Platform 2023. Note that Nuke 14 series will continue with OCIO 2.1.x. Another thing that comes to Nuke 15, and because of the update to 2.2.1, is the ability to read in OCIO Z files. So this is something that you can explore from the OCIO website, in which you can essentially package up all the display transformation and zip it or compress it into an OCIO Z file. And this means if you're working with another studio, you could go ahead and package that up, hand off the OCIO Z file, and you can read that into Nuke and have all that display information ready. So with that, just to sort of summarize what we looked at here, the OCIO write updates, OCIO aliases, the modified OCIO configs, and the ones that are packaged inside of Nuke. And of course, you can define it further or define your own as well. For Nuke 15, OCIO v2, as well as support in 15 for OCIO Z. And then we saw there the saturation slider, so a very welcome addition built in directly into the viewer, so your gamma gain and your saturation. Another thing for Nuke that has been added is extended high resolution. This means if you're working on maybe large events, theme park rides, or you're working in virtual production and you have to output quite a large image, Nuke now supports a number of planar operations, and this is up to a resolution of 64K. This means that in 14.1 and 15, if you're using any of the Cara VR nodes to stitch into lat-long images, spherical transforms, and lens distortions, you can now output much larger resolutions and give you that scalability that you need for projects. Next thing we're going to talk about is OpenAssetIO. And this is a tech preview that has been is now a part of the Nuke 14.1 and Nuke 15. If you're not familiar with OpenAssetIO, we have a large amount of information that's available through our SIGGRAPH talks and through our website, as well as our YouTube channel. But essentially, it's an open source interoperability standard, and this is meant for content management systems or asset management systems. And it is currently being developed within the Academy Software Foundation community. And what this is doing is providing a layer between the DCC and the content management system. And this also means that you don't need to have hard-coded file system paths. These will get resolved, and this includes details of storage location, frame number, etc. So from the Nuke read knob, you notice that instead of pointing to an image sequence on disk, you're actually pointing to an asset instead. So this first tech preview release is really aimed at the pipeline developers and to get some feedback on here. The OpenAssetIO team would love to talk to anybody who is exploring this and working with it. And the initial integration here is into the Nuke read knob, but the longer term plan is write nodes, knobs, any nodes, opening scripts based on asset IDs from the command line. So this one really pushing towards those pipeline developers, not so much at the artist section just yet. And if you'd like to discuss this further, don't forget to head over to our community forums where you can post on all topics, including OpenAssetIO. Now let's talk about some updates to the library and SDK. So the ARI SDK has been updated to ARI Image 8.0. ARI Alexa 35 HDE support, so amazing compression support from ARI that is now supported inside of Nuke. OpenEXR library up to 3.1.6 and Avid DNX to 2.7.3. All right, so now let's talk about all the timeline updates, and there are quite a few, some exciting changes for the timeline. First thing we're going to look at is multi-pixel blink. So this means that you can have much more complex soft effects in the timeline, especially ones that require spatial processing. And you see this when something is, when an image and an effect it needs computation of more than 1 pixel at a time. And you see this with blurs or other types. So let's look at some examples. So these are just some brief examples that we can see inside of here. So we have our blink soft effect that's been added, right? We have our blink script soft effect. We're pasting the kernel inside of here. And what this is a saturation kernel. So under our kernel parameters, we get our saturation slider. So we can have a saturation soft effect running on blink. And remember, blink is designed to run real time in the timeline. That's why it is quite a powerful way to be adding new soft effects or working with ones right inside of here. So there are some examples. There's a nice one, which is a box blur inside of here. So we have those kernel parameters here. We have a curtain effect in here, and these ones require heavy, image manipulation inside of here. So it's nice to see how quick this runs inside of here. Now, these are some examples that you can be looking at and then developing your own, but also beyond that, this leads to a much larger sort of picture here. And that is about the larger sort of direction towards shot prep and distribution in the timeline. And we're going to see this happen over a number of future releases. But for this release in 14.1 and 15, there is now a new denoise soft effect that is in the timeline. There's a lens distortion soft effect in the timeline, as well as a corner pin soft effect. So all of that multi-pixel blink work has led up to this. So now we can have much more complex soft effects inside of the timeline. So great for shot prepping. Say we get all of our plates in and we have, we're lucky enough to get a lens grid inside of here. We're going to go ahead and do a lens distortion from here. So we'll just go ahead and detect, and then we can go and solve. And now we can go and copy and paste this lens distortion directly onto any of the shots in our sequence that have it. So now when it comes time to distribute, we're prepping for the artist already with the lens distortion node. They have their plates, and they're going to be using the proper lens distortion models for them as well. Even denoise, if we're using, if we're prepping with a denoise, and we don't have to write these out as hard-coded, because remember, inside of Nuke, we can package, inside of Nuke Studio or here, we can package these soft effects along and create those Nuke scripts for it, even copying and pasting from the timeline directly into the node graph and vice versa. So very handy if we're doing a review session, we're running it in Hero or Nuke Studio, we're adding some additional soft effects on the fly. They can be copied and pasted into a node graph to ensure that we're having the exact same settings and we're able to pass that on to artists. So we can go in and we can group our shots. We have our denoises that are affecting with different algorithms of different properties that have been set for each one of the sections. We have our lens distortion that's for the same cameras. We can go ahead and pass those on. And we even have the corner pin node. So let's say we wanted to go in and we want to make it very clear what we're going to be doing the operation to. So whether we're going to be roughing it out with the corner pin inside of the timeline and setting some keyframes for it, or we're prepping it as a part of the whole shot prep. We're prepping the corner pin, we're prepping the lens distortion, as well as the denoise. And that brings us to a next section, which is machine learning on the timeline. That's right. There is the inference node on the timeline. And this is, again, really improving the artist efficiency and productivity. So this means there is a new soft effect. It's the inference node. So let's say we did do our compositing on that earlier shot, but there are more shots in this sequence that we need to, again, apply that same model, which is we want to mat them out so we can add some additional fog in the background. So we can quickly check here if we added all the shots inside of the sequence and we add an inference soft effect and we're pointing at that training that we did earlier on. So we just did that one training. Now, how is it going to affect the other shots? Let's go ahead and take a look. So we'll jump over onto our first shot and we're pointing at that cat file. And then we will get the output here. Actually, quite impressive considering we trained on another shot and we had no ground truth information for the head and the beard, etc. So I'll put this into the B buffer. And then we can go ahead and examine. So that's actually doing quite a good job here. So we know that we're probably going to have to add some additional ground truth images to further our training. But right now we can sort of see which ones are going to need the most work. Let's go to the next shot, which is walking now further back in the forest here. And again, quite a good job. We're going to need probably some additional ground truth image, maybe for the foot area, and we'll have a look and just make sure everything is lined up well for the rest of the shot. And then now let's look at this last shot. So he's on a bicycle this time. And again, very impressive considering we trained him walking through a forest, but it is recognizing, thanks to that human matting algorithm, recognizing the human in the shot here. And we're getting a lovely matte for it, but there's a bicycle this time, and we can see some of the handlebar here. This is going to need some additional ground truth images. So if we have our CopyCat, let's say we have a comp that is sort of our generic CopyCat training comp, where we're going to be adding additional ground truth images. Well, then we can have our footage in. We're going to be picking some ground truth images from the sequence, and then we're matching those exact ground truth images with the input, and then we're going to be adding additional training. But this time, we're not doing a fresh train. We'd be training from a checkpoint, pointing to that CopyCat file on disk, and then adding to that data set and giving it a deeper data set. So we're covering all scenarios. So in the end, we're using this one inference node to cover all of our situations. Okay, so with that, just to summarize, the supervisors can be training and applying models across multiple shots on the timeline and really getting a handle on what's happening for all the shots on the sequence. And note that everything we talked about is also available inside of Hero. The next thing we'll talk about is auto timeline disk caching. So when you're working inside of the timeline, there might be times where we want to cache areas of our timeline, and not RAM cache. We want to do a disk cache, and we can do so from the caching section or by right-clicking on our clip container. Now, maybe this is something we want to do here. We have a lot of transformation. We have lens distortion. There's denoising and grading. So we want to cache this out to disk. So I'm going to select the shot, and we're going to cache the selected shot ranges. So what this means is now we're writing out an EXR sequence to disk of the accumulation of all these effects and what it means inside of the viewer. And then we can see that we'll begin to have a hard disk cache, and that is represented by this orange line here. Now, the new automatic disk caching mode, which we can set here from the sequence properties, the default is manual, but we can set it to automatic. And this means that if we make any changes in this section, we will automatically get a cache for it. So let's go ahead and I'm going to turn off these soft effects for a moment. And then what's happening is now it is automatically caching this area. No need to go back in here anymore and then select the cache, the selected shot ranges again to cache it. It's automatically being done for us because it sensed the change within this section. So now we have a cache for both situations. So if I was to enable these soft effects again, it's found the old cache and then applied it here as well. So the auto timeline disk caching, this is the two modes, the manual and automatic. And this really helps you if you're using those heavier soft effects in the timeline. We can go in and then make a hard disk cache for that and not have to think about having to recache it again. Some additional timeline updates as well. So there is a new viewer rendering UI locator. So that'd be located right around here on my screen, but you can see it here. So if we are piling up a ton of soft effects and the image does need to render, there is a progression icon that will be circling around, so you can see, and it will go away once it is complete. And there's all new a new transform behavior as well. And essentially, if you're familiar with compositing in Nuke and the rules of concatenation, whereas you want to be applying your transforms in conjunction to each other before applying other effects, this is essentially the same way that you would be stacking them in your layer inside of the timeline, right? So remember that you can be moving your soft effects in a layer stack down here. So you want to be grouping your transforms. A couple of other things here we'll talk about is the multiple playheads. So you may have recognized here, we have all of these now down here. And notice I'm on playhead number 3 currently at the moment, and it's highlighted here as well. And just like Nuke, you can hit 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can add new playlists all the way from 1 to 0. So you can have 10 playheads inside of here at any time. And they'll respect buffer information as well. So what that means is if I'm over here and for playhead 3, and I hit, let's say, put this in buffer B, you'll notice that we have the icon for buffer B and then the icon for buffer A as well. And that is applicable to all the playheads. Now, because things have been mapped from 1 all the way through 0, those of you familiar with the timeline, normally you'd be placing your buffers by using the 1 and 2 key. That is now switched to A and B. So I'm hitting here A to switch to the A buffer, and then B to switch to the B buffer. So that is a update to that as well. So let's just put this to all tracks. And there is also now the auto select clip. So this means that you'll notice that if we are scrubbing in the timeline, the clip below is automatically being selected. So this is a lovely workflow improvement for efficiency, because this means that I can just go there. I don't need to select the clip. I can add something like a grade node. It gets applied to the clip right away. And then there is also relative paths for comp containers. So you'll notice that there are comp containers inside of the timeline here in different areas of this sequence. And previously, the path to where the comp container where the Nuke script lives had to be hard-coded, but you can now use relative paths for those comp containers as well. So making it really easy to hand off projects, whether you're taking it from one section to another or sharing the work with somebody, and it's you don't have to worry about those paths for the comp containers. So you have truly relative paths throughout the timeline tools. So the next thing we're going to look at is the monitor out updates. So those that are familiar with network device interface, so that's NDI, that was added into Nuke, where you can broadcast your Nuke viewer or your timeline viewer, and it can be picked up through a stream. It's a great way to do team reviews or client reviews. For this release of Nuke, there is now NDI audio support. So it supports 2-channel output when you're using NDI as your selected output. And any active audio tracks in the timeline will be output through these 2 channels. Also, the latest version of the NDI SDK update has been updated. Also, some additional monitor out updates. So the Aja SDK has been updated, Blackmagic has been updated, as well as 10 and 12-bit RGB output has been added to Blackmagic devices. All right, everyone. So there we have it. So quite a stacked release for Nuke 15 and 14.1. Let's just go through here quickly and summarize. So Nuke 15 gets the VFX Reference Platform 2023 update, as well as the macOS ARM support. Throughout the whole Nuke family, the new 3D viewer selection, the scene graph for the mask knobs, USD version has been updated. Now there's USD Python binding support, OCIO 2.2 for Nuke 15, the file formats and SDK updates, OpenAssetIO as a tech preview is now in Nuke. The saturation slider has been updated, extended high resolution support. On the Nuke X side of things, there's the air performance updates with the new training strategy and the new properties inside of the progress tab for CopyCat. macOS MPS support, the distributed training as well. On the timeline tools, the multi-pixel blink support, denoise soft effects, lens distortion soft effects, corner pin soft effect, inference on the timeline, auto caching, the viewer rendering indicator, monitor out updates, and the NDI audio support, the auto selecting of clips, the multiple playheads. Comp container has relative paths, as well as the new transform behavior. So it's a very exciting release, and thank you for watching.